Okay, so welcome to the panel on neuroscience. Um, that will last for the next hour and 45 minutes. My name is Bessel van der Kolk. I'm in Boston. Uh, our speakers are Robin Cathar Harris, who is at the Imperial College in London, who I think many people would consider the foremost neuroscientist in the area of psychedelic and mind-altering substances. And his postdoctoral student, Christopher Timmerman, who is somewhere in a cabin in the UK, I believe, um, who's hooked into us, and my long-term colleague and friend, Rachel Yehuda, who has been a major contributor to the field of the neuroscience of trauma in many different ways, and who is also a veteran of Burning Man, who is really helping us to get the atmosphere of Burning Man in the desert and the heat into this panel. So we'll start with Robin.
Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be with you. I'm going to do a crash course of no longer than 14 minutes of some slides that I have. And I've been told just to dive in and give you what I most want to give you. So I'll do that. And it'll start a bit dry because in my view, it kind of has to. Psychedelics are drugs, they're molecules, and they work on the brain at the molecular level. And we actually know how they work on the brain at a molecular level with quite a high degree of precision, perhaps surprisingly. So we know that they work on the serotonin system. These are classic psychedelics, the LSDs, the psilocybin, the DMT, classic psychedelics. And we know that they work on the serotonin system in a particular way. Serotonin is a really complex neuromodulator, has a range of different receptors, but we know that the 2A receptor is critically important for their action. If you block that receptor, people don't trip. The proportion of those receptors that are occupied by a psychedelic drug, a given dose of psilocybin, relates to how intense the trip's going to be. These psychedelics are like serotonin imposters. They come in, they hijack the serotonin system, the 2A system specifically, and they stimulate those receptors. So a little take home here, remember that these 2A receptors are heavily expressed high up in the brain, hierarchically high up in the brain, in the cortex, that aspect of brain that humans have so much of, and high up within the cortex. So remember that. What do 2A receptors do? They promote plasticity. We can look at markers of plasticity like BDNF. We can look at synaptogenesis, the bits of the neurons that do the communicating. We can look at 2A involvement in brain development when the brain is especially plastic and learning all the time. We can look at learning itself and unlearning and how 2A receptor stimulation promotes that. Look at this chart on the right. You drop in some LSD and these rodents are learning things much more quickly. You block that 2A receptor and that learning is retarded. This is low-level associative learning that's promoted by these psychedelics. Cognitive, psychological flexibility, also some evidence of promotion via psychedelics. So the take-home there is 2A receptors are what do the business with psychedelics, and they're involved in plasticity. Oh, let's skip on. And they're also involved in adaptability. That's probably why they're there. That's probably why they've evolved. When you stress an animal like us, whether it's physiological stress like hypoxia or social stress, you prime this 2A receptor. You get their levels pinging up. They're more available for stimulation. So let's think of these conditions. You have a primed 2A system under stress. Then with acute stress, the most reliable way to release serotonin in the brain, short of taking a drug, is to punish the animal. Induce acute stress and you spike up the serotonin levels. Here you can see those charts at the bottom with tail pinch, 200 doubling of serotonin release with tail pinch, and also handling release of serotonin. So what's going on? Forget about psychedelics. Why these 2A receptors are there. We can look at stress. We can look at these receptors pinging up and then stress releasing serotonin, inducing that natural plasticity, natural adaptability. These pivotal mental states are the fundamental here. Psychedelic states could be thought of as an example of something more fundamental, pivotal plastic states in which you can induce people in a way that we manipulate the context that they're in, the plastic state that they're in, and we could push them towards wellness, or if conditions are adverse, they could gravitate towards pathology. You could think of trauma as being a pivotal mental state, and how people might gravitate towards pathology, PTSD under such conditions. So this is an overview of the latest clinical research. I think in the interest of time, the take-homes really are rapid, enduring improvements in symptom severity, different symptom clusters, so potential transdiagnostic action, and then context being critically important. All of these modern clinical studies have manipulated context in a favorable way. So this is psychedelic therapy. These aren't results from people being given psychedelics. These are results from people being given psychedelic therapy. Remember that, it's critically important. So transdiagnostic action, the model that I'm proposing here is that the common denominator that's shared among these symptom clusters are habits, negative habits of mind and behavior. Maybe they're sort of attempts at a sort of functional solution to maybe, you know, anxious uncertainty, intolerable anxiety, and instead we choose an addiction or develop a compulsion or a compulsive negative thinking. So the model is that we come in, we relax these heavily weighted habits of mind and behavior, and we work towards their healthy revision. And that's what psychedelic therapy does. Now, this is an awful segue. It's not a segue because they should be smooth. It's more like an abrupt, you know, ripping of the chapter structure, because this is about the acute action of psychedelics. And I'm borrowing Chris's excellent work here. So credit to Chris for this and some of our collaborators. And I just wanted to share this because it really excites me. And it's kind of where my mind is at the moment. That here it's an analysis run by our collaborators, Joanna Cabral, Gustavo Deco, Morten Kringelberg, Simone Ebert, doing this work and looking at how the brain transitions into different states under DMT in this case. But these are quite similar results to what we see with other classic psychedelics and that we published on. And the take home here is that the brain is much more likely to visit a globally coherent state under a psychedelic, where everything is kind of doing the same thing. All the different regions are in phase, they're phase locked. There isn't much sort of differential activity going on in a sense. And what states, what networks, what states are you less likely to enter under a psychedelic? Lo and behold, they are those networks, those states, those networks that have the highest expression of the 2A receptors. These frontoparietal networks, you can see them in orange or gold there, and also the default mode network. What does that mean? Well, let's come back to the beginning. 2A receptors disproportionately expressed in the cortex and in high level cortex. Aspects of the brain that talk to each other more than other lower level aspects of brain, the unimodal cortex, the motor strip, and the visual cortex. It's this high level system where you get the 2A receptors, and it's this system that's scrambled under a psychedelic. You don't go into this state. You don't visit this system, this ego system under the psychedelic. I slipped that in. And if you look at cortical expansion, macaque to humans, lo and behold, those regions of the cortex that have expanded most are where we get the highest expression of the 2A receptors. And here is a map from Chris's work where he's looking at where in the brain is becoming more similar to the rest of the brain under the psychedelic. And again, it's that same network. It's getting smudged in with the rest of the brain. No longer is it different, a distinct system that you enter linked to high level abstract cognition, thinking far into the future, those things that humans do with such aplomb. That's getting scrambled up. The ecosystem's getting scrambled up under the psychedelic. Entropic brain, simple principle. The more entropic or unpredictable the activity in the brain over time, the more unpredictable and complex and rich is our conscious experience. We can look at dreamless sleep, deep sleep, and how activity becomes more regular, more predictable, and consciousness is lost. You go into dream sleep now, consciousness comes back. It's nice and rich, and so is brain activity. You look at normal waking consciousness, rich brain activity, throw in a psychedelic, it leaps up. It's richer still, both the ongoing brain activity and conscious experience. That's the rule, that's the principle. The last one I'll leave you with is Rebus, which is talking about the hierarchical organization of the brain. I've already alluded to this with that previous slide. And essentially it collapses under a psychedelic, and the hierarchy is needed for the encoding of high level assumptions and belief. And if you deweight that, then you're going to allow for a spill of contents from aspects of brain that are usually compressed out of conscious experience. We've recently looked at cortical traveling waves, again, Chris's data in collaboration with a French team, Van Rulen's team there, and we saw this fascinating switch in the direction of cortical traveling waves under DMT. The switch is just as if people go from eyes closed, where the waves flow in a top-down way from the frontal cortex to the back of the brain, to a bottom-up direction, as if we have our eyes open. Very dramatic, very clear, very strong relationship with the subjective experience. It's as if the lights go on, you have your eyes closed, inject in the DMT, the lights go on, you're in this world analog, and the waves switch. So that, for me, fits the Rebus model. You relax the hierarchy, you flatten, democratically flatten that hierarchy, and now the information flow can flow up more in a bottom-up way. Of course, work that needs to be fleshed out. We're just scratching the surface, but these are models. All models are wrong, some are useful. Let's see how useful it is across time. Let me end on this. This is our recently completed double-blind randomized control trial. We went head-to-head with a leading Prozac-like drug, established antidepressant, escitalopram. People either got 2 big dosing sessions with psilocybin 3 weeks apart over a 6-week trial period, or they got 6 weeks of escitalopram. Really exciting findings there. This will really put the cat amongst the pigeons for why really we should be excited about the potential of psychedelic therapy. So I'll end it there with that spoiler. Thank the team, the wonderful young team, and thank our supporters who've made our research possible. And thank the audience for listening. And I look forward to the rest of.
Okay. Well, we'll have some discussion about all this later. So, my name is Bessel van der Kolk, and I'm actually mainly interested in trauma and all its variations. Like many people who study trauma, I started at the VA. I learned from soldiers, and then I come to realize that the trauma in soldiers is just a very small part of the trauma that happens in the world, and that the vast majority of trauma that occurs happens at the hands of your own relatives, that the greatest dangers for women is their partners, the greatest danger for children is their own parents, and you open up the whole spectrum of man's inhumanity to man and people, how people survive the most horrible circumstances. In that context, of course, the new thing that came in was neuroscience, and as luck would have it, I was part of the first team that ever took a PET scan of people having a flashback, and that to me was really very, very telling. What it really opened up is that, you know, as psychologists, we think that most stuff happens in your consciousness and you have words for it, a language for it. And once neuroscience became really relevant, it became obvious that much of what we do and how we organize ourselves and how we engage with the world are deeper brain processes over which our consciousness has no control, or almost very little control. And so I've been stunned by the development of cognitive behavioral treatments at the same time that we get to know more about how these subterranean influences in the world that are not subject to cognition or much really drive people to feel miserable and to feel angry and to feel scared all the time. And you cannot talk yourself into don't be scared, don't be angry, because you need to really work with the deeper processes. Um, and so that first brain scan that we did, we had people have a flashback in the scanner. It was a horrendous experience. You would not get IRB approval for that today because it's just too horrendous. And what we discovered is that these is front of the brain, back to the brain, right to the brain, left of the brain. The imprint of trauma is in that right temporal area of the brain, which is a part of the brain that has really no cognition, no words, no understanding. It's really just like a oh shit experience, like oh my god. It's like you feel have intense emotions, no cognition. And what we found on our scan is that the imprint of trauma is in the right side of the brain. Nothing happens on the left. The right side of the brain is sort of emotional, global, spatial, not cognitive. Left brain is, you need left brain to organize cognition, and that sort of goes offline. And the most dramatic finding in our the first neuroimaging study was that Broca's area, the area of the brain that you need to for language, for telling who you, how you feel, how you are, basically gets knocked out. So Shakespeare once again was right. And when people get upset, he says they became dumbfounded. They became struck with speechless terror. And that is the core of trauma is that you cannot talk. You just go, oh my God. And then later on you construct some story to deal with it. So that really got us into things. And then slowly, as neuroscience evolved, we got to understand more and more that it's not about particular areas of the brain, but it's about what is talking to what and how the brain gets organized in order to engage with the world around you, with yourself. And I think the most important findings, as far as I'm concerned, in neuroscience about trauma, is how these brain networks change. And so you focus on different things, you have different executive functioning, you have different organization, you pay attention to different things. And one particularly striking thing is your sense of self gets dramatically altered. And that's something that Robin Cartwright Harris, of course, has done a lot of work in. And he finds that while people are in their psychedelic experience, the default network gets activated. Now, that's interesting from our point of view, from the trauma point of view, because the default mode network is the part of the brain that has to do with yourself, with remembering yourself, knowing who you are in relationship to other people, having a sense of yourself in time and space. And it turns out that that system is very much negatively affected by trauma. And so this is one of the many great pieces of work done by Ruth Lanius at Western Ontario University. How she puts a bunch of normal Canadians in a scanner, looks at the default network, plenty of normal people and kind of no trouble finding them. And here's the default mode network. This is the part of your brain that tells you this is who I am, this is what I stand for, that's what's important. And there's this whole back of the brain which has to do with where your body is, what your body is feeling, where you're located, knowing sort of where the substance of yourself is. Then she puts 18 very traumatized people in the scanner, and that's what happens. The default mode network gets pretty much destroyed. There's no sense of self. And I wish that people at the VA would start paying attention to that, because when you're a traumatized person, life passes you by because you don't feel alive and engaged with the present. It's not about a memory of the past, it's that also, but it's most of all that your brain that cannot engage with the present anymore in a sort of sense of this is who I am, this is what I stand for, and then your trauma becomes central. And so a recent piece of work from Ruth Lanius' lab was really important. This is the default network in people who are not traumatized people. And at rest, this network is very activated, so it gives you a sense of self. And when you're threatened as a non-traumatized person, your whole default network goes offline, and only the most elementary part of your brain, the paraactive gray, which sort of I call it the cockroach part of the brain, part of your brain that makes you scurry and fight and react, gets activated. And interesting. picture came on the screen that maybe we want to knock that out. Um, uh, and then she puts traumatized people on the scanner and look, under ordinary conditions, the default mode network is not activated and she exposes people to threat and they come to life. Their default network becomes active. And so the problem with trauma is you feel alive when you feel your trauma and you feel dead when you don't feel your trauma. So that's a very big issue. Um, and that's what we see in clinical practice, that the trauma keeps sort of haunting people, but people feel alive and organize their lives. They're in the middle of it, and that gets us into psychedelic agents. So I'm always looking for what else can we use to change this internal disorganization. And um, I was invited by Michael Mithoff and Rick Dublin to be this principal investigator of the MDMA arm in Boston and to treat traumatized people. And what got me interested in MDMA primarily, I had never taken it, unlike most people I know who have taken ecstasy at parties. I hadn't. But what everybody told me about is that ecstasy gives you a very deep sense of self-compassion. And this issue of self-compassion, which Robin also has shown in his work, um, is very central to MDMA. And what has struck me so much in working with traumatized people is that when you ask them about, so how do you feel about that kid who you were, who got molested, who was incested, what you come up with is this deep sense of self-hatred. I'm no good. I'm a terrible person. And at the core of so much trauma is this core sense of I'm a terrible person and I'm awful. And so I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to do MDMA research to see if that self-hatred and that self-loathing could be calmed down and then people can go visit themselves. And that's very much what we see in our study. And so this is the outcome of a previous arm of MDMA for PTSD. Uh, and people study PTSD, unfortunately, and not really what really happens. But you see very dramatic results, which was also what we see in our lab. And what you see in our lab is that people are open and eager to visit themselves when they are on MDMA. You lie there. Um, it is MDMA assisted psychotherapy. So you just use the MDMA in order to make a therapeutic potential possible. People are very well trained in particularly a method called IFS, Internal Family Systems Therapy, which is extremely helpful for trauma. And people go very deep inside. And it is no picnic. In my own experience also, as a PI, I had to go through my own MDMA. The main thing I said over an 8-hour period was like, oh shit, are you sure this is a party drug? Oh my God. And so I got to really see a lot of things in my life that I had been unable, unwilling, blocking out to visit. And I went there and it was very painful, but it was okay because you view yourself with compassion. And so it's very interesting. So what is it that drives that compassion? And people have been studying it. Robin has studied it. Also, that there's the decreased connectivity with the right insula, which is really carries your bodily sensations. And as you may know, my book is called "The Body Keeps the Score" because trauma is about the body continue to react as if you're in the middle of trauma. And so, what it appears to be is that MDMA and maybe other substances also change the networks in the brain, so you can visit yourself and feel what you have been carrying. And what you see in our work is that people go to these deep experiences and they say, now I feel what I went through. What an awful thing I had to cope with. But what people are able to do as, as a result of the experience probably is that they're able to see that this happened to me in the past. It's not happening to me in the future. And that's, of course, the nature of traumatic stress, is that you feel it's happening right now. Uh, traumatic stress is not about the past because the past is over, but traumatic stress is how the past continues to be inside of you, and you keep reliving the past in your body as if it's all happening again. And what is so striking about what MDMA allows people to do, apparently, data look very good, is to visit themselves and say, oh my God, that was a terrible thing you had to go through. And thank God today is September 3rd, 2020, and it's over. So that's very dramatic. And what we know of other pieces of research, like Tanya Singer, is that the various things that happen on the MDMA, where you get more compassionate towards yourself, you get to understand yourself better, you get to feel, oh, this is what happens, and you find words for your internal experience, that all of these things are related to changes in the brain. And I think our job as neuroscientists at this point is to see how these networks get altered by the psychedelics. So that's what I have to say. Um, the next speaker is Rachel Yehuda, who is one of the smartest person I know and who will put it all in perspective.
Uh, Thank you very much, Bessel. And I'm not going to use slides. I appreciated both the talks that did. Um, I'm just going to make a little commentary about this and talk about how to integrate maybe some neuroimaging work with other aspects of neurobiology of psychedelics. So like Bessel, I've also been studying the effects of trauma from a neurobiologic and clinical perspective. And like Bessel, I've recently gotten very excited about the idea of treating PTSD with psychedelics. And we plan to do a trial with MDMA later this year at the Bronx VA. It'll represent, I think, the first randomized clinical trial of a psychedelic at a VA with combat veterans. But because I'm also a neuroscientist who has been studying the neurobiology of PTSD treatments and how they work, I've been thinking a lot about how to use the tools that we have in neuroscience to better understand the effects of psychedelics. And so I think at least the question that I have is, how do psychedelics help catalyze the changes that people make that puts them on the road to healing from the effects of trauma? So I would add to the conversation that we're having by making a couple of observations on this. First, we, ha- we have to really understand this. There's a very big difference between what psychedelics do in the short run. That is what you might see while people are being scanned in an fMRI while they are in a non-ordinary state, and between that and between the long-term brain effects of that potentially transformative session. So one question might be, what explains how the short exposure to a psychedelic yields such an enduring transformative change in a person? Now, it's clear that psychedelics have short-term effects on brain functioning, and you saw these pictures, especially on neural circuits that can show tremendous moment-to-moment variation depending on what else is going on in the environment, like the default mode network, or especially when we talk about MDMA, we talk about um, effects of MDMA in quieting down the amygdala, which is presumably the fear center of the brain, and increasing activity in the prefrontal cortex, which effectively does reverse a biologic state that we think is related to people's avoidance of traumatic material. And as you've heard, it is widely hypothesized that this is what makes it possible or more likely for people to confront a traumatic memory while they're taking a psychedelic. But the short-term effects of the psychedelics are not necessarily or not even likely to be the same as what we would expect to see in the long term. So it may be optimal to quiet the amygdala down when confronting the memory of a trauma, but no one thinks that it would be a good idea to shut down this circuit permanently. We need our amygdalas to be responsive to the environment. We have to be alert to real threat. And even this narrative that we're shutting down a fear center is something we have to be very careful about, the reductionism involved in that. We're not exactly sure what the consequences of reducing amygdala activity are with a psychedelic. Again, it depends a lot on what else is going on. The amygdala is not only involved in fear, it's really involved in learning, it's involved in sexual activity, has a lot of jobs. All these brain regions wear a lot of hats. So it's definitely true that the amygdala is activated. That's what we see with these studies. But we want to be mindful that of the stories that we tell ourselves about what brain imaging findings mean about the psychedelic experience in the short run and in the long run. And we, as in the field of cognitive neuroscience, really have a lot to do to link psychedelic-induced states of consciousness really with behaviors or traits. That has yet to be done, although this is a very good start. What I think must happen is that MDMA facilitates a state that is then conducive to exploration of a trauma. And that if that exploration is successful, well, this generates a different way of thinking. And that leads to further healing. And it's that process over there that I would be very intrigued about its neurobiology. Now, obviously, it's very exciting to see a brain scan, a picture of our brain on psychedelics. And it's reasonable to ask what would explain the decreased functioning of the amygdala or any other brain regions in the short term. And Robin hit upon the serotonin receptors, which is a part of it. But the full answer is that these short-term effects are probably best explained by pharmacology, by the pharmacology of whatever psychedelic, be it MDMA or not. MDMA results in a release of serotonin, not only serotonin, but dopamine, adrenaline, oxytocin, cortisol. And this flooding of neurochemicals and hormones can affect short-term changes. So for example, both oxytocin and cortisol are known to have direct effects in reducing firing in the amygdala. So, but these effects are for the most part transient. Now in some cases, and the planets have to align just right for this, a hormone or neurohormone or neurotransmitter is capable of inducing a more permanent and enduring effect. But this again depends on a lot of other things that are happening, which would be a very good time to introduce epigenetics as a mechanism that might help us explain some of those things. Because if the question becomes, how will the non-ordinary state yield changes that will become stable traits, that's the science that's going to help get us there. And the brain imaging will help us visualize it. But epigenetics is the study of how experience transforms the way our genes function in a manner that can sometimes be transient, but more often than not be enduring. And epigenetics, in the last few years, we've come to understand that it explains a lot of phenomena that are actually associated with trauma and PTSD. Most often, what Bessel told you, that people who are traumatized feel that they're not the same person that they were before the trauma. I mean, they have the same DNA, but they don't feel that it all works the same way as it did. They don't feel their reactions are the same as they were. They don't feel they're responding to things in the way that they did. And epigenetics can really explain how programs in the genes really get shifted so that you're functioning a different way. And epigenetics also explains why the effects of trauma can be present in children and grandchildren of trauma survivors. So when it comes to epigenetics and psychedelics, there might be short-term effects of psychedelics that you might be able to visualize right immediately due to maybe the pharmacotherapy. Maybe some of these phenomena explain why people who are taking psychedelics often revisit traumatic events of their ancestors. That's a thing that commonly does happen. But the effects, the epigenetic effects that I think we really want to chase are those that occur after the psychedelic journey, as integration of the altered state becomes manifest into a real behavioral change or a change in perspective. Again, I think I'm coming from the perspective of studying trauma. And I think that the problem posed by studying the effects of psychedelics is really similar to the problems of studying trauma itself, because you get very different perspectives about what's happening when you study the neurobiology of the acute response to trauma versus the long-term effects. Unfortunately, no one any longer believes that the story of why anyone would develop or sustain PTSD has to do with the biology of trauma as it is happening, or the fight or flight response, or the arousal, or the lack of escape, or the feelings of helplessness. All of those things definitely happen. They probably could be visualized. We studied those things for years, hoping that they would explain why people get PTSD and why they sustain them, until we realized that the real story had a lot to do with what you were like before any of those events happened, and a lot about the things that happened afterwards. It took us a while to understand that, and it took us a while to understand that the biology of PTSD is a moving target. It is completely dynamic and unfolds over time. So it is a developmental condition where things are constantly changing. So what we're really interested in now is what catalyzes those changes. What is the big event, and how does that big event change something that then allows those changes to catalyze, even though the immediate effects would dissipate quickly. So with psychedelics, we can study the acute effects, the fight or flight, of what it looks like in the brain when these powerful drugs completely disrupt normal neurochemical and hormonal flow. But we may have a very different story that explains the longer term effects that are only manifest with the passage of time, as the acute effects abate and are substituted with transformational change. So my lab, just to end, has been studying for a really long time, maybe 15 years, the neurobiology of therapy of PTSD. We do biomarkers, including imaging, before and after all forms of psychotherapy and sometimes pharmacotherapy. We're interested in what predicts change and what change looks like biologically when people have successful outcomes. And we've identified epigenetic changes in this. In some cases, we've used fMRI to visualize changes in circuits. But the point of that is really to say that taking psychedelics without the intention of healing, or for recreation, or whatever use you might have for the psychedelic, might have a very similar pharmacology to MDMA taken for therapy, but it may have a different neuroscience, because the neuroscience that is involved in understanding how MDMA works might have more to do with some of the recruitments, some of the systems that are recruited in getting better. And now we have a great opportunity to learn that, because we've been studying a lot of the biology of regular therapy, and we can see if just resilience or getting better is one process, or whether really there's a different process when it's psychedelically induced. So it's very exciting. And I guess I'll close by reminding us, again, in the spirit of being cautious about how to interpret all findings, including neuroimaging ones, is that in the 1980s, as this government made MDMA illegal and also banned other psychedelics, a lot of what was used to justify that, though clinicians were up in arms that the government had taken away a very valuable agent, was neuroimaging data from SPECT studies. And these were widely misinterpreted as showing holes in the brain, or just the going from the acute effects of MDMA to really trying to understand the long-term ones. So the studies were not really designed to answer real questions about psychedelics. They were designed with a political agenda, and we want to be careful about that here too. We have a big responsibility to design neurobiologic research properly and thoughtfully. And I think it really means extending beyond the pharmacology and delving into the biology of actual traits and experiences that are gained from psychedelic use, including what Bessel said, self-compassion, gratitude, and the spiritual and mystical effects. Thanks.
Thank you for now. Good. So our next speaker is Christopher Trimmerman, speaking from a cabin in the woods somewhere. Go ahead, Christopher.
Thank you, Bessel. I'm actually speaking from a boat at the moment, but close enough.
Oh, goodbye.
So I think it's great to follow up on what Rachel mentioned at the end of how can we better understand or glean on what we're learning from these findings, or as we're trying to understand these transformative experiences that psychedelics induce, what are we learning along the way? And this is a bit what I'm going to talk about now, is what can the subject learn, the person going through these experiences, and how can we frame that learning in the best way possible? And then us as researchers who are trying to understand the phenomena or grasp the phenomena from a biological and a psychological perspective, what is the best way that we can try to understand what we're seeing, the data that the data is showing us, more specifically at the biological, the neuroimaging side of things, and the psychological research, right? So this is what I frame as this notion of psychedelic apprenticeship, right? This idea of developing a gentle touch. So to start off, the main idea, or just to kickstart things, is to illustrate what the evidence is showing, is that anecdotal reports have been there for a while, and what the research is kind of like catching on to a bit is that these are potentially transformative experiences, that psychedelics induce long-lasting transformations in the brain and in the mind, right? So we have actual structural evidence showing at the neuronal level how the form, the shape of the brain actually changes in animal research, and also how the function of the brain changes, how connectivity patterns apparently show enduring changes after a single psychedelic session. These changes lasting up to a month. And this is a bit the graphical description that you see here below. These are different brain areas and their connectivity between them. But we also see these transformative effects at the psychological level or at the mind. So the work, for example, that Roland Griffiths and the Johns Hopkins team has done has shown how supposedly very stable traits like openness to experience, a personality construct, can show meaningful and lasting changes following a single psychedelic experience. Also, some of their research has shown how a single ingestion of psilocybin can become one of the most personally meaningful experiences, or one of the top 5 most personally meaningful experiences a person can have throughout their lifetime, right? We can also think about transformative effects in terms of mental health. So this is the work of Robin, and what he showed in this pilot open label study, that a single or 2 sessions involving high dose psilocybin with psychological support generates this lasting reduction in treatment-resistant depression. So again, a transformative effect when we understand it from the level of mental health. Some of the research that I've been interested in is how psychedelics can transform our most fundamental perception of what reality is, or conceptions about reality, what I call metaphysical beliefs. And what we've seen in some of this research is after a single ceremony involving a psychedelic, what we've seen in some of our surveys, can radically alter supernatural beliefs or beliefs concerning ideas of free will and determinism that people may have. And also their metaphysical position regarding whether or not reality is constructed from, for example, the material and the mental. That's the position of dualism, where we see radical increases which last up to 6 months after a single administration of a psychedelic. And the idea, this is very much related to this notion that psychedelics, especially the very intense experiences, not only changes the way that we relate to ourselves, but they might also change our conceptions of reality. And this is what has been labeled as this kind of like ontological shock that the experience has. So the first hypothesis is that these changes, these transformative changes, when we try to understand the data, at some level happen at the psychological level and at the experiential level. And these are the drivers of these transformative effects in a big way are the psychological insights, or the insights that come from these experiences. Why they appear to be so long lasting, and this is another hypothesis or speculative component that I'm proposing here, is that it's because of their noetic quality, because they feel true, they feel unmediated. What people usually talk about in these experiences is it's almost as if they've come from the ether. They have a realization, a strong aha moment. And this goes back all the way to the work of William James, who described this noetic or these aha moments as states of feeling mystical states are not only, states of feeling, but they're states of knowing or knowledge. They're states of insights into the depth of truth, unplumbled by the discursive intellect. They are illuminations, revelations. They're full of significance and importance. And although they are inarticulate, they carry a curious sense of authority for an after effect or for an after time. So there's something about this kind of like spiritual or mystical type component of these experiences that has this sort of lasting effect. And it feels unmediated. And because of this feeling of subjective feeling, it carries this kind of like long-lasting effect. Nonetheless, evidence shows, as also Robin showed in his slides, that these insights are always mediated by set and setting or context, right? And this is why a lot of attention in terms of the psychological support in the clinical research has centered on this non-pharmacological factors, the set and setting factors, and how that can also enhance the therapeutic consequences of the psychedelic experience, right? And we can think about this mediation as occurring in different time scales. So you have a psychedelic experience and you have immediate past events generating expectations, the same about biographical events of the past, and even the wider cultural context in which this occurs. And we can think about the same about integration of these insights in a larger time scale as a way in which these insights or these learnings are mediated. And not only that, these insights, the contents that which arise during a session are also embedded within larger cultural contexts. So for example, if somebody has a psychedelic session within a neo-shamanic context, it's very likely that the contents that they will experience and the learnings that will come out of that experience will be very different from if some of our participants has a DMT session in a lab, right, in an fMRI scanner. The important thing is to bring to awareness that these different contexts carry with them their own agendas of sorts, if you will. And those agendas permeate the acute experience. So what I also want to propose here as well is that these insights sometimes generate problems, tensions, ethical questions, if you will. So this is a specific example from a patient undergoing psychedelic therapy who experienced a revelation during a psilocybin session in a clinical trial. So the session content focused mainly on a confrontation that the patient had with a cruel creature, which the participant took to represent a repressed memory of his mother trying to smother him. Right? So the participant has this experience, and after the session, when he's talking about it, he mentions, when it happened, it felt more real than the here and now. I do think that something must have happened in my past, something pretty severe in my childhood for this treatment to take me back there. But what do you do with it? Do you just deal with it? So the problem is that this participant had this kind of like reenactment of this repressed memory, apparently, but the mother was dead. So he had no way of actually confirming or validating this insight, this knowledge that he had. Here we have another example of insights that can happen in a more psychonautic context, if you will. So this is within our consciousness research. A participant was given 20 milligrams of DMT intravenously. And she mentioned, I felt the presence of an alien substance, a green gooey alien substance, which is not organic. And that made me realize that everything is silicon-based stuff, which once was gooey, now is fossilized, and this fossilized gooey stuff is what makes reality. This is the foundations of our actual living reality. So these kind of like experiences, these apparent insights that people have during these experiences poses questions at two levels. At the level of the experiencer, of the subject, they might question, well, did I actually experience that, or am I putting words on something very ineffable, something very difficult to verbalize, and I'm just trying to make sense of that? And at the level of the researcher might ask, well, did she actually experience that, or is she undergoing some process of confabulation, if you will, mild forms of confabulation, just trying to make sense of her experience, putting words on something? So what I propose is a framework to deal with this. So how can subjects make sense of their own experiences, and how can we make sense of these insight data, is this idea of psychedelic apprenticeship, and this idea in which we take a second approach to the study of these altered states, these transformative experiences, right? So the second person approach is basically a middle ground that occurs between a first person approach, so a person having their experience without any sort of mediation. It's just subjective experience. It is unmediated and therefore possibly biased, versus a third person approach, which would be considered at times reductionistic. So we're just taking this kind of like neural events, and we're saying that any subjective experience is just a result of this kind of like neural event. It's unmediated as well, and it also has its own biases. The idea of a second person approach is that any sort of insight, any sort of data is put into intersubjective mediation, right? It's a disciplined approach to try to understand experience, these psychedelic experiences. And then what we can learn from this experience in relationship to brain activity, or the connection between brain activity and the subjective experiences, is that through this mediated approach, we then try to understand our neuronal finding, our finding that we see in fMRI, our images of the blobs, the connectivity between the networks, and so on. So for example, in research contexts, we're trying to validate invariance of experiences. So what, for example, DMT does, regardless of set and setting, or what does LSD does regardless of set and setting. And at the neuroscientific approach, we're trying to understand these neural correlates of these experiences, right? Specifically, like Rachel said, maybe those specific mechanisms that occur during a session, not this kind of like broad average session, but those moments in which maybe insights occur, what's happening in the brain. So we can, for example, take a finding. This is some of our research involving DMT, where we see these brain regions which are hyper-connected here on the right, and this desynchronization of these brain rhythms, this alpha and this beta rhythm. And when we look at the brain in this kind of like unmediated approach, we say, well, this is what DMT does to the brain, right? So by taking a second person approach, we've tried to expand on that and see how subjective experience can inform of this neuroimaging findings, so that we can get a better understanding of that, right? So I'm going to go back on that later, but the idea is that person has the experience and we do a mediated form of interviewing, right? A detailed phenomenological inquiry in which we help people re-evoke their experiences. And the idea is that this specific attention to phenomenology would help us grasp better invariance of experience, that the actual nature, if you will, of that DMT experience. And that enabled us to separate the experiences into a bodily component, a visual component, and an emotional trajectory, and how they are unfolding over time. And by using this method, we were able to, for example, tap into stuff in the data that we didn't see before. This enabled us, for example, to see that the visual component, the trajectory of the visual component of the DMT experience, consists of increased low frequency activity, reduced alpha and beta, which are signatures which you see very much in states of dreaming. So through this kind of like second person neurophenomenological approach, we were able to glean better on what the data was showing us. And the whole idea of this kind of like second person approach is that by having some form of mediation of this first person experience, which you can see here again, the acute psychedelic experience and how it's influenced by like the different layers, temporal layers of the person, when you're mediating this framing of experience through either phenomenological inquiry in research contexts or forms of integration in psychedelic therapy, you're able to generate, if you will, bootstrapping better the notion of the best ways in which we can integrate these psychedelic insights. How can we deal with the pitfalls of psychedelic knowing, if you will? And ideally, you can take this into a larger sort of like cultural framework in which you have communities of experiences, therapists, facilitators, and researchers engaged in the psychedelic experience in this kind of like intersubjective mediated sort of framework. That's the basic idea, which I find particularly relevant as the substances are becoming increasingly mainstream and where there's strong commercial interest? How can we develop cultures around these experiences that can help us glean on these insights? And yeah, that's it for me. Thank you. I cannot hear.
You're muted.
Thank you. With our new technologies, we tend to get enamored by technology. And what I've seen with as our technology has improved over the last 30, 40 years, is that the mind has sort of disappeared a little bit from the picture. Uh, what are people really going through? What's the experience? What is stirred up in people? What comes to light? What's going on inside of people? Um, and for me, also the very big question is, what happens in the long term? Uh, Anybody who has gone through a psychedelic experience, as both Rachel and Chris mentioned, they have very profound experiences. Rachel and I have a common friend who is terminally ill, who went through the the psilocybin experience, who was truly became a transformed person. Who I even suspect that he has lived as long as he has, because his whole attitude about himself and the world was changed because he had a mystical experience on psilocybin. And so I think it's also terribly important for us to really see what changes in people's perceptions of the world. How do people see each other? How do people treat their loved ones? Are they capable of being more open, more vulnerable, more explorative? Are they less paranoid? Are they less frightened? Are they less? Are they learning new things? Uh, Early on in my work, I became very interested in the Rorschach, and I still think that the Rorschach is the queen of psychological measurements, and that you can really project yourself on a stupid ink blot, and whatever you see there is different from what other people see. And there's been a lot of work in that to really show how that has to do with how you perceive yourself and how you see the world. And all of that is sort of missing right now. So I'm really delighted that Christopher is really beginning to once again open up people's attention to what happens in the mind and what happens in people's perceptions. But I think, to my mind, that's the big missing piece right now. Is that we have these stupid rating scales of DSM, which nobody believes in anymore. But we still do science using DSM categories, which are hopelessly inadequate, for example. And so, what really happens to people? How do their perception of themselves and the world change? How do they see themselves in relationship to other people? Is a very necessary next step.
If I may interject, since this is about ketamine a bit, and it's a totally different neurotransmitter system, not 5-HT2A, but glutamatergic, and the experiences you've so wonderfully described occur quite frequently in our work with ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. I wonder if the panel could address itself a bit to the ketamine neuroscience issue. Thank you.
Well, I, we realize that you're our host, and we are here at your at your beneficence. But le- many of us here haven't done ketamine research, and I wonder if you guys have any thoughts to Phil's invitation.
Well, I mean, ironically enough, we had a great conversation about ketamine as we were waiting for this to go on live. And I think that one of the big differences is that the field of psychiatry isn't thinking about ketamine as a psychedelic. It's thinking about ketamine and very interested in the pharmacologic effects. And so the idea that ketamine might help somebody or transform them, which I don't think is a claim for ketamine, isn't based on combining the idea of the opportunity of a potentially altered state with ketamine with helping somebody change the way they're feeling about a thing. It's really more practiced that you go home and you wait until the ketamine wears off. And so the question, I don't, it might happen differently in certain clinical practices, or before ketamine was legal, it might have happened differently underground. But certainly the way that ketamine clinics are set up, the way that the FDA approved ketamine, that's the model. So I guess what would be really great would be to be able to build on that work by examining how the biology, the glutamatergic biology, and everything we know about the effects of ketamine,
But of
how
course,
that
Well,
changes
Rachel,
psychotherapy.
I would just interject that I think your perspective is the perspective of the uh, anesthesiology people and doing injections and sending people home. But we have a vast amount of data, and we've been publishing on ketamine as an assisted psychotherapy with extraordinary transformative changes. And that's what we're seeing, that's what we're doing. And that niche is expanding overall. It's just that when the work began with David Charney and others, the suppression of the psychedelic effects was a political decision and remains one for many people. And so a lot of research has been pushed into that realm rather than really looking at what's going on with tremendous transformative situations that we're repeating again and again. In many clinics, we've trained 310 people
Yeah,
in how to do this, and we're expanding ketamine as the legal psychedelic all across the world. So just to finish the comment, and I'll bug out, I think
you don't have to bug
that
out that.
the neuroscience, Robin's done a bit of a paper on comparison. Yeah, sorry.
I think it's a great comment. I think the problem is that the FDA approved ketamine as an indication without the necessity of any psychotherapy. And so now is an opportunity to really demonstrate the added benefits of psychotherapy on the biologic substrates that people are examining as proof of concept that ketamine works, including its effects on gene expression networks. So, I mean, this is an important time to show the difference between pharmacology and combining and using a medication to catalyze a psychotherapeutic process. Because to the extent that all of these compounds produce a very similar end in neuroanatomy or in molecular biology, what we're saying is that these are all biological components of growth and resilience and kind of positive change through psychotherapy. And they're not dependent on pharmacology or the specific action of one compound. So I think that that's a really important thing that we have to do, particularly because people are now figuring out that ketamine effects do wear off. And can psychotherapy be the thing that makes ketamine assisted psychotherapy just as powerful as other kinds of psychedelic induced psychotherapies in terms of its longevity, transformation, and kind of enduring effects on how you think.
but in order to do that, I think
Well,
we
I
need
like that. I would agree.
we
And
do.
all I would say to it is that the FDA approved S ketamine for a certain kind of very limited non-psychotherapeutic practice,
Yes.
but the off-label use of ketamine for psychotherapy is vast and increasing. And if you even look at the practice of people doing intravenous injections, it's more and more associated with increases in dosage and reliance on psychedelic effects, and often now being bulked with psychotherapy. So I think the field is moving to recognize that. And I will keep quiet now because it's your panel, but I wanted to bring in the ketamine issue. Thank you.
Well, Phil, I think what you're saying is terribly important, and it's interesting to have Rachel and Robin also in the panel, who are very much within current political funding streams, where certain things get funded and other things get ignored. And so the technology of measuring how people change psychologically is extremely limited right now. And people feeling more generous towards themselves, more compassionate towards other people, more. It's wonderful to see Robin hold this little baby, because for me that's the paradigm of it all. How do you feel holding that little baby? Does it make you feel all warm and inside? What my veterans used to talk about is, when I hold my baby, I feel nothing. You go like, wow, that's not good for you. It's not very good for the baby. But nobody is studying what that deep sensation is of holding a little kid who calls you daddy, and you go like, wow, this is amazing. And for these experiences to come in, which really makes our humanity. And once these experiences become cut off, and you stop having loving feelings, and you see the world as a conflagration of horrible people who need to be killed, how do you calm that down so you actually become have a theory of mind to see where other people come from? And I think that's really what we need to focus on as much as anything, because that's the piece that's missing right now. And I'd love to see the data on how ketamine has changed people's lives, not changed their PTSD score.
Yeah.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I just can't let your comment pass. I agree with you about how people with PTSD have a hard time relating to their children, but I just want to complete that thought. It seems to go away with their grandchildren, and so I have treated. We know a lot of people, Holocaust survivors and Vietnam veterans, that have really remarked how they wish they could have found this feeling that they have for the children of their children with their children. And so there's something there to learn about the developmental progression and the permanence of these kinds of experiences, and how when that needs to be shut off
Yeah.
because you're in a survival mode, but you haven't really lost it completely because things are changing. And so the biology that we want to have is one that helps us track these kinds of changes.
See, it's interesting, because you're such a great scientist, but when you talk about this, it's purely anecdotal evidence for which you have absolutely no data, but your face lights up like, man, people really recover their capacity. So we should show that, we should really see what opens up people's hearts. And I think that's why it's so great to quote William James, because he was living at a time that you could talk about stuff like that and not get punished for it. So how do you measure how you open up people's hearts and make them generous and stuff? Yeah.
I think if I can just cut into that, I think it's quite interesting what's happening with psychedelic therapy, because in a way it is a bridging of this kind of like psychiatry practice and this psychiatry way of understanding the way to do treatment through pharmacological action, and the idea of psychological support. And this kind of idea of psychological support, which is still under development, and there's still different things being tried out. But ultimately, I think it speaks about a more kind of like holistic approach to understanding the person, if you will, in which this kind of like, it's not ineffable components, but these components of human experience, which appear to be so important, so valuable for each of us, are kind of like in that know-how, in that practice. How do you come with compassion to a patient? How do you approach that therapeutic process with that sort of like softness or openness in the heart, in a way? And I think that's kind of like in my opinion, like a beautiful side effect of the whole kind of like psychedelic therapy approach, which is it is about viewing the person in that complexity.
I mean, are part of the inclusion criteria for letting people in the study that they have a person in their life that can take care of them and support them? I mean, I would imagine that doing this kind of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy with people that have a person that takes care of them, or a significant other, or a parent or a child that they're in a good relationship with. It might be very different than somebody who's a complete loner. Have you come across that in your studies, Chris or Robin?
I've been really, maybe you guys want to say something about it? You have more experience than I do.
I mean, I can indirectly, Robin can take it as well, I think. Based on
Sorry, I just passed over my little one to.
Yeah.
But the question was, do we always ensure that there's a support network for people coming into our trials? We haven't historically made that a exclusion criteria if people don't have that, but experience is now teaching us, as it does, that that it's critically important, actually. And our next trial is in anorexia, and perhaps it's especially acutely important there. And so it is. It's a actual exclusion criteria if people don't have, you know, a next of kin that is part of the therapeutic process, actually. And there's a much stronger emphasis on support network in this anorexia trial going forward. And
So all these decisions that we make about who we study and who we treat, and all of these little factors from the study of neurobiology, I mean, this can completely shift the kind of findings that you get. And so it's just really important to be aware of them. There is no other place where set and setting is discussed, but part of set and setting is not just what happens in the short term. It has to do with the preparation. Are you doing this because someone is supportive of you doing it, or not supportive? Or what do you come back to afterwards? And that a lot of the changes that we could expect to see that are not strictly pharmacologic are going to take in all of these non-specific factors. So I think it is important that we start developing, you know, like the DSM-5 scales. I'm with you on that, but I think it's very important to develop the questions that we want to ask about these experiences, these noetic experiences. And I recognize, Christopher, that's exactly what you're trying to do. I think that is critically important to substitute symptom reduction with a set of constructs that are associated with recovery, healing. And
I would just add, in the MDMA studies that we did, and the continuing ketamine-assisted psychotherapy work and studies we're doing, family attendance and participation have been a component part of all of that. And then we call it building the nest.
Mhm.
And the nest needs to have nice feathers and to have support and to be able to work out conflict and struggles within the nest. So that is, for us, an essential part of making this work really therapeutic and beneficial.
See, I think this whole brings up the whole issue of side effect and danger, because everything that works also has downsides. Huh? And when we started our study, I was extremely concerned about people who basically had no pre-traumatic personality. And we see a lot of people like that, people who have always been abused, neglected, unwanted, put in orphanages, etc., etc. And I actually advocated very strongly with MAPS to not call those people the same thing as war veterans or rape victims who had a good life before, because it's really a different category of people, neurobiologically and psychologically, etc., etc. MAPS overruled me, much to my delight in retrospect, because it turns out that people who have had no pre-traumatic personality did surprisingly well on MDMA. And that really opens up some real questions about, again, what does MDMA do when you have no memory of being loved, no memory of being cherished, no memory of being held lovingly on your daddy's knee? That still these substances have a capacity to induce a sense of belonging and being okay in people, which is spectacular, actually.
because you're feeling the love from the therapist. I mean, it's
Yeah, but you don't notice people. They're nice people,
You're
but they don't.
developing, I mean, I think that what we hear most often from people, and it's emphasized in the MAPS training, from people that have undergone the experience is the extent of bonding. In the MAPS protocols, there is usually a male and a female and therapist, and it really invites a kind of reparative mommy-daddy
Very,
dynamic.
very.
It's hard to study it. It's non-specific. It can
Yeah.
vary from therapist to therapist.
I've
But
seen my.
these are very important issues to look at,
But
especially apropos your
the-
question.
It's a
Well,
fascinating topic, but I mean, one might also ask the question: is love, fundamental? Even if you didn't experience it as an infant, is there enough of human, condition in you from what's passed on that you still know love, that you still have capacity for love, and you could appeal to things like Jungian psychology for a principle like that. Fascinating topic to think about.
it's very intriguing. You know, I expected that we would have some very nasty adverse effects in people with very bad chronic trauma histories, and we didn't see them in our very small sample. And I wonder, Robin and Chris, what do you see in terms of adverse effects and onwards reactions in people?
I mean, I could speak to the depression work a little bit, Chris, and maybe you could give some examples from DMT. But I mean, on the sort of more superficial level, you would say that the side effect profile is very good, and the most common are headaches, transient headaches that you get the next day. But that's not really telling the whole story, because we know that the experiences are so rich and sometimes horrible, and a lot of struggle. And yet, the paradox that afterwards people can be doing great, and their depression scores have dropped right down, and their well-being scores have leaped right up, and yet they experience some degree of hell during the experience. So it's tricky. Do you call that a side effect, an adverse event, when it's got them well through some kind of hero's journey? So I don't know. I mean, to the mainstream, you would hear that kind of thing, and it could easily, set off alarm bells at, oh, this sounds like, psychotic episode or something. But it, the paradox is that they're
You're
doing very.
frozen, Robin.
Sorry?
What you say, Philip? I think, see, the side effect I'm worried about as a trauma person is that people get stuck in their horrendous situation. And we see that quite often in psychological treatments, that people go and have a flashback and they feel like it's happening again, and they sort of get stuck there. And much to my amazement, I've not seen that in our MDMA therapy. We have a small sample, and then people go very deep, but they somehow come out of it, and I'm really very intrigued with that. I'm sure not everybody does that well, because there's so much horror in people's lives that comes up. So, but basically, you can also say that you don't have psychotic reactions, or you don't need to hospitalize people, or you don't see suicide after any of your substances.
No, I mean, you might have psychotic moments and psychotic symptomatology if you want to frame it that way, but really it's part of the the process is how we see it, and this is all interesting information. We try and avoid judgments of the veridicality of apparent recollections. So you heard one case there from Chris. I think it's good practice not to make a call on such things, but still be there with a open heart to hear and listen and talk through with that individual. But it's certainly not for us to make a call on whether the memory is real or not. Yeah, very complex.
Maybe just to complement on the potential side effects, and it's not something that we see necessarily in in the DMT trials, or maybe even the clinical practice, psychedelic therapy trials, is that, and you see it out there in people engaging with the substances, is this phenomenon of spiritual bypassing. So the idea that people engage in a life transformative experience, they have like some form of spiritual awakening, if you will. And then there's down weighting of the relevance of the personal life, or the personal challenges or the struggles of life, because now there's this kind of like alternate realm, or this spiritual dimension, which is complete unitary whole, as opposed to, you know, the importance of working through everyday struggles. And this has been kind of like also associated also a bit with the more far out experiences, like what happens with 5-MeO, DMT, and things of this sort. I would say that the potential, if that could be called a form of side effect, are those this phenomenon, specifically of spiritual bypass.
It's such a subtle one though, isn't it, Chris? Because, you know, I've just I was lucky to get the Upanishads for as one of my birthday presents, and there, you know, you hear about the realization of interconnectedness and you know, oneness, and in such contexts, you know, and we see this in psychedelic therapy, you just think, well, that's such a healthy, grounded, and true realization. I mean, you can just look at lots of different aspects of science to see the truth of principles of interconnectedness. There's nothing otherworldly about it. There's nothing supernatural about it. So it's a very subtle one, isn't it? It's when those spiritual realizations, which are probably the, you know, arguably the greatest realizations that people can have under a psychedelic, or forget about psychedelics, realizations that people can have, and they're ancient, you know, right. And yet sometimes they go wrong, or sometimes they're used as escape. So isn't it a very sort of, it's a very subtle, potential complication there.
Definitely, I completely agree. I mean, I think it's a realm in which the good can be used for the not so good things, as you say, even a form of dissociation. This idea of going into the spiritual realm because everything is kind of solved there. And then again, I think that, you know, coming from a Western perspective, in which we're so good at grasping these kind of like ultimate sort of truths or realizations, going into a realm in which things are always dynamic, or, you know, the idea of spiritual enlightenment is usually the learnings are very kind of like difficult to grasp, according to, you know, when you read these reports, right? It's like the bridging of things are really challenging at times. And this is where kind of like the cultural frameworks is where the challenges or the invitation is lying ahead, I think, with psychedelic therapy.
But also the therapist training, because to your point, Robin, of how people might react to a patient who is having a dissociative experience, what you're afraid of, Bessel, during a psychedelic experience, that's where the training comes in, of whether you can hold the patient through it, whether you don't freak out. And right. In Western medicine and Western psychiatry, you see somebody's blood pressure climbing through the roof, and you see, you know, them getting highly, highly emotional in a very depressive state or a very confused state, and you want to immediately reverse that. What is the rescue drug? And so that is going to be a very important thing to teach and train a new generation of mental health providers, that things that previously we would have thought not in psychedelic moment were dangerous and must be dealt with immediately as urgencies will pass in a safe environment if you trust the person, that you trust the person's inner healer, that you trust the process, that you trust the medicine,
that all comes with
that you can differentiate between that and a real effect that has to be intervened with medically at the time. I think that these are challenges in really the paradigm shift that is incumbent upon us, which is why this work and this session about neurobiology of psychedelics is so important. I think to the people that know and love psychedelics, I mean, all of this stuff is so confirmatory of what they have known sometimes for a really long time. But the challenge of getting people who are naive in terms of their own use or their own experience and have been trained to think of symptoms and abreaction in a certain way. The data that we collect about the biology, the language that we develop about the psychological processes, it's so critical. And to be able to have discussions that cross not only into the public, where many people, I think at least 5% have tried psychedelics in the United States. It might be higher. Yeah, it depends what you read, but yes, I mean, there's some, but not a ton of experience with it. And in mental health settings that are very traditional, I can tell you it's not a thing that people have a lot of their own personal psychedelic experience. One reason is because of the that it's illegal, and another reason is that it's not something that a lot of mental health providers, let's say, gravitate towards, which I think is interesting. The majority do not. The majority are worried about this, skeptical about
Depends on who you
this.
hang out with, Rachel.
What? I'm
It
sorry?
depends on who you hang out with. You hang out at the VA. In my
I don't
world,
just hang out in the VA, Bessel. I think in your world also, which is more of the clinicians, I think there is some reassuring that needs to be done, that this is safe and that people have the right training to be able to shepherd somebody through it. I'm in your world too. I give lectures to the same crowds.
so my,
So
my greatest concern is, my crew says, hey, we're part of a revolution. And I keep saying, you're part of a second revolution. I had Timothy Lear's old office at Harvard, and I know what happened with the first revolution. And the first revolution ended up in disaster. And so my great concern is to be very careful and to be very strict and to be very controlled and to do psychedelic assisted psychotherapy and not let it out of the hands, because it worked out very badly the last time around. And it would be a pity if all of this beautiful work that's being done right now would go to waste again.
And if it's all right, just to hopefully articulate the principle that we're all alluding to here, that there is a classic schism in mental health care research where you're either in the psychology camp and schooled in, maybe depth psychology and psychotherapy and your Freuds and such like, or you're schooled in biological psychiatry and you pride yourself on being very medical and precise. And in the psychedelic world, we have to inhabit both spaces, because we can't get away from the fact that these are drugs that work in a particular molecular way on the brain and the body, yet they are psychologically so rich. And the therapeutic model that we've come to understand depends on a psychological harnessing or a therapeutic harnessing of the drug action. So you have to have a foot in both camps. I think you could be too psychological, arguably.
you're so right. You're so right. The revolution here isn't in the use of psychedelics. The revolution is that this is what we have always meant by the fact that most patients need a combination of pharmacotherapy and psychotherapy. We just didn't know how to do it. This ended up sending somebody to one person to get a prescription of an antidepressant and sending them to another to get some talk therapy, increasingly with a few sessions of cognitive behavioral therapy in the field of PTSD. The reason that this is a revolution is because it doesn't matter what the diagnosis is. It's transdiagnostic. It understands the approach that every person has things they have to work out about what has gotten them here, and that it is a process that facilitates that inner exploration. So it's exactly the opposite of where psychiatry has been going in terms of farther compartmentalizing and making little diagnoses and making things be very different from one another. And it's way back to the beginning of not caring how a particular mental health problem is expressed in terms of what you call it, but understanding that there has to be some facilitated process for transformation and healing. So I couldn't agree with what you said more.
Can I go back to what Robin said about his getting the Upanishads for his birthday? Because that seems to be sort of a very universal experience. And that's part of why I got into MDMA for PTSD in the first place, in that people who have PTSD live in a very narrow framework and see the world from a very constricted point of view. It's something we actually showed very clearly on our Rorschach studies. Um, and what psychedelics do is they expose you to a reality that you didn't know was alive there, and it really makes you aware of the cultural corset that we all live in, and the cultural assumptions that we live in. And almost everybody I know who has had repeated psychedelic experiences sooner or later um, develop some mystical Buddhist notions about the world because something manifests itself there. That seems to be, we have to sort of admit that's probably real, that our narrow constricted view of the world is a very narrow constricted view of the world, actually. Yeah.
And maybe also like the the wise old heads that discovered those realizations all those thousands of years ago emphasized practice. That it's not a one-shot awakening and then you go about your everyday life, a Buddha. There's this strong dependence on practice. And I actually, when Chris is talking about cultural shift and Rachel's talking about this paradigm shift, and one would hope that there is this healthy integration, that it's not that there's a danger here that people could hear this kind of thing and think, oh, psychedelic therapy is going to become like a religion. It's not that. It's just that Buddhism arguably isn't a religion. It's just that there are certain healthy things that people can do that help sustain wellness. And yeah, more or less, that's it.
What I'm hoping that people will see is that one of the things that psychedelic use can promote is a better sense of community, especially since COVID. I mean, but I'm always asked this when a tragedy hits, a problem, a pandemic, a war, adversity. You have a lot of reporters writing a lot of stories and calling up and asking, are we going to be traumatized forever, and what should we do when things happen in the world? And the answer is not really everyone should go to a mental health provider immediately right now. It's how do we build resilient communities, supportive communities, communities where we can contain and respect people, and what are the lessons that we can take from set and setting that we can bring to our communities that can help people understand that the way we induce healing is by creating the proper environments where healing can occur. The psychedelics are very powerful at aiding that, but they don't do it without the set and setting. So
The basic question.
If I could interject one comment. So one part of this whole week of presentations is just on what you've said so well, Rachel. And we have the Indra's Net Coalition, which we're presenting, which is just about working with trauma in all its various forms and creating sharing groups beyond the psychedelic, because the psychedelic is not available to everyone. And we've just had the good fortune within this week of creating a coalition with Deepak Chopra on just the same thing. So we're trying to build a worldwide coalition to deal with trauma in the ways of building connection and community. So I appreciate your comment.
See, in my mind, this raises the question whether we shouldn't have the people who come in our studies be dependent on us for that experience, but whether we should also facilitate
Can't you
people.
just get my battery? Can't you?
Hold on. People with their own experiences, and because it's such a profound experience to go through it, and should we not actually support people who have been subjects in our studies to form peer support networks where they can share stuff with each other, where they're not only dependent on people who take down these little notes and do these little rating skills, but they actually have a real support system of like, wow, I had a mind-blowing experience. Did you too? What was it like for you? To really form human connections through the work that we do.
Yeah, I mean that's exactly also why I referred to the concept as apprenticeship, because it engages this intersubjective aspect of it. And I think that the one of the challenges with psychedelics is that because it doesn't require a growing into the practice like it happens with meditation, right? In which there's a development over time. It can happen, you know, like on command, if you will. Not, it's not that obvious that you will get a necessarily a super blown mystical experience, but you can facilitate one with a higher level of certainty than you would if you would engage with meditation in one day or so. So because of that kind of like hazardous speed or velocity of gaining these insights, that's, you know, the importance of this notion of building set and setting communities, or building a sense of lineage, if you will,
Right.
and intersubjective, you know, mediation, you know, on grasping these insights and putting them in an intersubjective medium. And I think this is where both I find the institutionalization of psychedelics can provide a real value. Like the idea of medicalization gets criticized sometimes by the psychedelic community,
Yeah.
because in a way you're kind of like depriving this kind of like added value that community might have. But at the same time, in that institutionalization, there is a form of community that can emerge in a way, and good practices, and as long as it's done right.
Provides us with community.
Yeah.
It
Medical.
always, what
And the
does it
science.
provide people who work with the community? It's a real question.
Yeah. And I guess what we're all speaking to is that both the, you know, very pervasive power of psychedelics and psychedelic therapy, but also arguably why there was pushback against it. That, gosh, this sounds like system change now, you know, come join the mushroom cult, you know. And there you want to say, oh, well, no, it's not that. It's not that. It's
Also,
just, you know, and it's, but you see, we have a complication here. There's a way to do it and a way not to do it, where you know, and arguably the way to do it might be to try and do it sort of framework free. But what does that mean? What does that mean? I don't know.
Rachel, you're smiling and nodding, but what's on your mind?
No, I mean, I think that that's exactly the conundrum, and that's how I ended my talk, reminding us that the imaging that that was done in the 80s actually was used to shut this stuff down. Um, and I totally agree with you. I think, uh, you know, the what I when I try to speak about this, I try to be as, and you'll forgive the expression, as sober as possible, because I think that there's something very important about that, that somebody should, that that will help connect to people that are a little bit afraid of what psychedelics can do. I mean, this is ironic to say in a Burning Man event, and when I spoke about this last year, it's the last thing I felt. I felt that it was really fun to talk about psychedelics in a place where nobody in the room was going to feel that what a dangerous thing to be introducing to our culture. So that was really great. But in the settings that I'm in, there's usually a lot of fear, and even by people that want to embrace it, there are the risks. What if something happens? And I think that we have the responsibility of really trying to do our work so that it is really responsible work, so that people can you know, trust fall to it, and people can understand that it's been vetted and that you could try this at home in the right ways that it is being recommended, and that we are careful about including people. I mean, the things in psychiatry trials that are often so problematic are the inclusion-exclusion trials. In order to protect the safety of patients and data, we really enroll a very small sliver of the population compared to the people that come seeking help. And you never know. I mean, in my protocols, you cannot have been suicidal for, or you must not have been suicidal, maybe ever, or certainly not for a really long time. That's not the average patient.
No, you
And
can also
so,
be dope, which is not your average patient either. Like,
well, so you wanna
Affect the next program.
wanna do this right.
Yeah, and people are looking in at these findings and then extrapolating to such a broad population, and they're not conscious of the selectivity that's gone on there with the screening, and so, you know, they should be aware of that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Great. What a great discussion, Bessel. Thank you for organizing this.
thank you for coming. It's so fun. We are in the desert of Nevada right now, whether you know it or not.
We're really not, let me tell you, I've been to the desert and this is not it. But hopefully next year.
Yeah,
Next year in Jerusalem, as we like to say.
we do that. Okay, thanks all so much. I hope to uh, spend some time together again at some other
Okay,
occasions.
take
Okay,
care. Bye, everyone. Thank
bye.
you.
Bye.